Welcome everyone to today's program brought to you by the American Sheep Industry Association. My name is Jay Parsons. I'll be your host, and I'd like to start by saying thank you to the American Sheep Industry Association and the Rebuild the Sheep Inventory Committee for providing funding for today's program. You can learn more about the American Sheep Industry Association by visiting their website at sheepusa.org. And on their homepage, up in the upper right-hand side, you'll see a link to their Grow Our Flock initiative, which is what the Rebuild the Sheep Inventory Committee is all about. And if you follow that link, you'll find a recording of this webinar and many other informational items to help you better manage your sheep flock, whether you're just starting out or looking to continue and grow your flock. If you want to go directly to that website, you can use the URL growourflock.org. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce today's speaker, and very excited to have this topic, managing your pastures better, and very excited to have Dr. Woody Lane with us here today. He's a livestock nutritionist and forage specialist with Lane Livestock Services in Roseburg, Oregon. And Dr. Lane is going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll entertain questions for the last half hour of our webinar. And want to just preface this with letting you know that you can type in your questions at any time while Dr. Lane is speaking, and I'll funnel those questions to him when he's done and we hit the Q&A session. Once we are in the Q&A session, you can also raise your hand, and if you have a speaker attached to your, or a microphone attached to your computer, I can unmute your microphone and you can actually talk to Dr. Lane directly and ask your question that way. And I encourage you to do that because a lot of times that gets some really good questions, some depth to them, and so on, that's pretty difficult to type into a questionnaire box. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Woody Lane, and we'll learn about managing our pastures better. Dr. Lane.
Well, hi. Thank you, Jay, for that introduction, and I'm very delighted to be here, and this is a pretty important topic, and I'm glad a lot of people are joining us, and I'm sure more are going to join in the next few minutes as the electronics work. We're going to talk about something maybe a little different than a lot of people normally consider. This isn't just about pastures, it's about a way of dealing with pastures. I teach a course in pasture management, forage and pasture management. That's, well, right now it's going on, it's 8 weeks long, and 3 hours a week, that's 24 hours. I'm going to try to condense that into the next 45 minutes. So kind of hang on. We're going to talk about intensive grazing. Some people may have taken courses or something about intensive grazing or doing it. If anyone's doing that, could you raise your hand so we could so you could get an idea of how many people? Of course not. You can put your hand down now. We're going to talk about improved pastures and not range and certain types of other types of things like wheat pastures. Those are kind of special situations. I'm going to talk about things that grasses, clovers, broadleaf plants that can be used in some sort of an improved pasture situation. Now, people have heard a lot about intensive grazing. Intensive grazing is not the same. It's not just moving animals around from small grazing cell to small grazing cell. What we have is intensive grazing. Most people think it's intensive because you're moving animals. Actually, the concept of management intensive grazing, which we're going to talk about, is not really about intensive grazing. It's about intensive management. This is the type of thing that you actually do a lot of thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it based on the forage quality or the forage where you are, the numbers of animals you have, the amount of forage you have out there. You allocate feed, and things change as the progression of the season goes on and changes from year to year. It's kind of like a basketball game going on. You can learn the basic skills, but you don't do them by rote when you get on the floor. You have to adapt and adjust and move really fast. In management, intensive grazing is intensive management, and that's what we're going to talk about, based on forages. Now, I come from Oregon, and this is a winter scene, and some of you are sitting there going, you're hoping to get spring. Well, this is in the Willamette Valley on actually a grass seed field, and during, I would say, February scene. So how do we manage forages? Well, here's the big deal. Something that's really, really important right off the top. When we get a standard recommendation, I don't care if it's a lot of bulletins, extension, or NRCS or something like that, gives you a bulletin. They say, well, when do you put your animals in? When they're, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 inches high, you take them out when they're 3 inches. Well, that's okay, kind of, and yes and no. That's kind of typical, and everyone has seen those recommendations, and you know, pretty standard. It depends on your place. The inches are different, but nonetheless, that's basically your thing. Okay, let's take that recommendation and use it to manage the forages. Here's an example. If we have a ewe in early lactation who is raising twins, you know, an animal that's a ewe that's 30, 40 days after lambing, she's raising twins. My question is this: how many inches of grass does she need to meet her nutritional requirements? Think about that for a moment. How many inches does she need? How many inches of grass? Because I need to be able to do this, I need to answer some questions. How long can 50 ewes graze a 15-acre paddock? Or how many acres are needed to support 50 ewes for 4 days? Well, how many inches does it take to keep a ewe going? Well, if you can't answer those questions, then you can't answer that question, you can't answer these questions. If you can't answer these questions, you can't manage the pasture right. These are basically the same question, variations of the same concept. So, is there a better way? Well, the main thing is there's a major disconnect. The major disconnect is that our agronomic recommendations to manage forages are almost inevitably based on inches. How high is the forage when you put the animals in, when you take them out? Yet, our way of balancing, of working with the animals is that we do it a different way. We balance diets based on how much stuff there is, how much weight. We balance an animal's diet based on how much the animal's going to eat, and that's basically by weight or number of pounds of feed, or how many pounds of feed. So you balance a diet of a sheep. First you estimate what her intake is going to be, and then you that's your package, and then you fill that package with the nutrients she needs. And you look up how many nutrients she needs by looking at the reference tables. Okay, that's by weight. Well, what we should do, therefore, is manage forages by weight. And right now, we're not doing that. And that large disconnect makes it virtually impossible to be able to pull one thing and the other and put them together, because you're taking apples and oranges and going, oh, I don't know, how am I supposed to make this happen? We need to get at apples and apples. So what we're going to do is we're going to manage the forages by weight, which is, or otherwise known as mass, weight, mass of dry matter. You see it on top of the screen. Mass of DM is dry matter. And let's say the total mass of forage, you go out and look at a pasture, there'll be dry matters per acre. The total mass of a forage in an acre is 3,000 pounds. And all over the country, people are going, huh? What do you mean, 3,000 pounds? How do you do that? 3,000 pounds, what does that mean? Well, how do we measure it? This is a way of measuring. Now, I'll explain this in a moment, but take a look. In the upper left-hand side is a frame. It's a wooden frame, but it doesn't have to be fancy. It can be any way you want it, but you want a frame. A lot of them are 2 feet by 2 feet or 1 foot by 1 foot. That's not what we're going to use, but you get the idea. It's a wooden frame. You can take a large cardboard box and break it down, flatten it out, cut out the frame in the middle. I don't care how you do it, but you end up needing an area that you can cut, use shears. On the upper right-hand side, you can see one of the forage groups, and some folks are doing that. The lower left-hand side, you see the non-sophisticated way we do things. That's a postage meter. You need to do it in grams, and not 2 grams or 5 grams. It has to be single gram units. And on the lower right-hand side, there's a piece of equipment in a laboratory that would be called a forced air oven. I call it a fruit dryer, and I've done thousands of samples through that. Or you can do it in a microwave. Either way, the fruit dryer takes longer, much longer. Either way, you dry it down to dry matter where there's no moisture, and you can get a certain amount. But let's take back a look at that frame. I just said 12 by 12 inches, foot by foot, or 2 feet by 2 feet. That's what you normally see. That's not what we use, however. We use a frame that's 12 by 11 and a half. And the reason we do that was a rancher in one of my groups came up with this. He said, look, you take 12 by 11 and a half, and you cut down right to the ground. This is total mass. You want everything that's in there. And you got basically 138 square inches, 12 by 11 and a half. Those of you who can remember how to do multiplication, it's 12 by 11 and a half and 138 square inches. Okay, so you take this 12 by 11 and a half square inches, 138 square inches, take all the forage in it, you dry it down in a microwave or a fruit dryer until there's no more moisture. And let's say, for an example, we get 26 grams of dry forage. That's not including the bag. It's 26 grams. All right. Great. Now I got 26 grams of dry forage and 138 square inches. Well, that's not a very usable number. So how do we convert it? Well, actually, if you do a 12-inch by 11.5-inch frame, and what we want is pounds of dry matter per acre, all we have to do is multiply by 100. Or simply add 2 zeros, and it gives us 2,600 pounds of dry matter. If you use a 12 by 12-inch, like what's often recommended, you have to use a number like 95.95 instead of 100. That's harder to remember. So in groups that I work with and right in the middle of the field, we can do this in someone's kitchen. We take a sample and we do that, and the end result is we can get a number that we can use right away. It's very simple. We add 2 zeros to it. Now, the other thing is we don't do this 40 or 50 times in the pasture. What we do it is we do it once in the pasture. And we look at that very carefully. In today's world, you can take photographs of it, then dry it down, and then you get a number that says 2,600 pounds of dry matter per acre. You remember what it looks like. So what you're doing is you're calibrating your eye. What you want to be able to do is look at a pasture and say, oh, that's 2,600 pounds, there's 2,000 pounds, or 1,400 pounds, or 300 pounds, or 3,600 pounds. And you want to do it because you can look at it. There are other ways, there are more precise ways, but that's a good way. So there is a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, and it's pasture, and you can see it right there. So, by the way, this picture was taken, I was standing looking eastward. Behind me, about 100 yards, was the Pacific Ocean, and this was a winter day on the coast of the south coast of Oregon. So let's go back to our weight by mass, and that is our total mass of a pasture is 3,000 pounds. And let's start using these numbers and see how it all works together, because it gives you a handle on which you can make judgments based on some numbers and things that you can measure. So you got a total mass of 3,000 pounds. But when you're grazing or cutting for hay or something, you don't cut to the ground completely. You always leave some. And that amount is called the residual mass. And let's take the residual, let's say you leave 1,000 pounds. So you start with 3,000 pounds and you leave 1,000 pounds. What you have left in between is 2,000 pounds. That's the stuff, that's the available mass. That's the amount of forage that's actually available for grazing. So if you start with 3,000 and you're going to leave 1,000, you've got 2,000 pounds of forage for grazing. Well, if you have one animal that eats 2,000 pounds for one day, that's going to be one day's worth of grazing. But let's use an example that's more realistic. Let's take a flock size of about 125 ewes. All right. And we take that, an acre is, and let's go back, our acre has 2,000 pounds of available forage. That's what we measured before. 3,000 pounds minus 1,000 pound residual gives us 2,000 pounds of available forage. If we figure a ewe eats 160 pounds, or a ewe is at 160 pounds weight, averages, at 5% of their body weight of intake. Now, I know that there's some of my colleagues out there who are on this right now going, they use 95% of their weight, 4% weight, 3.8, 4, 4.2. Really, on a pasture they trample. They knock it down, they lay down on it. So it's an easy thing to just take 5%. It's a nice round number, and it's calculated out. This gets 8 pounds a day of disappearance of forage. If we have 125 ewes and at 8 pounds a day, they will graze 1,000 pounds of forage dry matter. Remember, we have 2,000 pounds of available forage, and they're going to use 1,000 pounds a day. So how many days are they going to be out on that particular pasture? 1 acre is going to take 2 days of grazing. And if we have a 3-acre field, we figure that that flock of 125 ewes will be good for 6 days. If they are there longer than 6 days, they will eat into the residual. Or if we've made a bad estimation and they only eat 4% of their body weight, that changes the calculation somewhat. That's really not important initially. You can always adjust for that. But these are the calculations that we would do. So you take a good flock, and it makes no difference if it's 125 or 825 ewes. The calculations are the same. Or not, if you take something that perhaps doesn't have a high in intake, and it kind of saves a lot. So let's switch and look at a very important thing, forage growth curve. How do forages grow? And again, we're not talking range. We're not going to talk wheat pasture or something like that. That is a very specialized type of grazing. We're talking a pasture in New York or Ohio, or Bermuda grass pasture in Florida, or here in Western Oregon, or an irrigated pasture in Colorado, or an alfalfa field. I don't care. Result, this type of stuff, it applies to all of it, all of those type of pastures. So on the y-axis, the total forage mass,
Hey, Woody.
total mass, and on the x-axis, the amount of time. Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but
I'm
your
here.
audio is kind of getting garbled. I'm not sure if it's your camera that's slowing it down or not, but you might try clicking your camera off until we get to the Q&A and see if it makes the audio come through better.
I just clicked off the camera. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
So how do you? So let's take a look at how do forages grow. Well, so do they grow like that? Well, no, because this straight line simply means that at the lower end of it, the lower left-hand side, they're growing just as fast as they're growing at the top end, and that means that, in fact, for every day of growth, they're putting on the same amount of dry matter. That's not possible because the lower end, where they're really small, they've only got a little bit of solar panels. So there's no way that those little seedlings or a little small amount of residual is going to grow as fast. So this is not a real curve. So they don't grow like this. This is how they grow. Forages actually grow. For those who are in science, this is a sigmoid curve or an S curve. Initially, they don't grow very fast, and as they put on more and more solar panels, they're able to capture more sunlight, and they really start to grow really fast, and that line almost goes nearly vertical. And that's your really efficient, for every day they put on a lot of dry matter per acre, and we can get, good pastures can put on more than 100 pounds of dry matter an acre per day. Well fertilized, highly good genetics can really put on a lot of feed per day. And then as it gets older, the pastures get higher and bigger, and there's much more mass. The lower leaves get shaded out, they senesce. So it's the top leaves that are really gathering sunlight, and so the amount of growth per day slows down. It still continues upwards, but it slows at a slower rate. This curve breaks itself into basically into three sections, three obvious sections. And you can see the breakpoints there at the breakpoints. And scientists, not being particularly resourceful or creative in their numbers, they call them phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. I guess they could have called them molary and curly, but that would really cause some problems when we start to write up for scientific referee journals. But the breakpoints are roughly about 1,000 pounds at the bottom and 3,000 pounds at the top. They're more or less the breakpoints. It's a little different for different species, but the end result is below 1,000 pounds of dry matter would be called phase 1. Between 1,000 and 3,000 pounds is phase 2. Above 3,000 pounds is phase 3. And think about this for a moment, phase 3. Let's take a 2-ton, let's take a field that's got 2 tons of hay per acre. You get 2 tons of hay. Well, 2 tons of hay is 4,000 pounds. And that's 10% dry matter. That's 3,600 pounds of dry matter. And you all know what 2 tons of hay looks like. So a hay crop that's 2 tons of hay would be on phase 3. You know what phase 3 looks like. Phase 2 is vegetative growth. It's leaf. Highly nutritious, almost inevitably above 16% protein, always above 12, but at least 12, maybe 16, 18, and much higher, often in the 20s% protein. Very high energy. So the nutritional back in the 90s. If you took inches, the first inch is 1,000 pounds. And every inch above that is 500 pounds. And that's what I taught my classes, the first class I taught. But we did that. And if you add up 5 inches of grass, you're going to get 3,000 pounds. 1,000 plus 500, 500, 500, and 500 is 3,000 pounds of total mass. And so people were using that. They said, oh, I got 5 inches of grass, that's what I'll do. And it turns out they came back in the next class, or the class after that, and they said, that didn't work. That didn't work at all. We were out of feed. We thought we had 3,000 pounds, and we were out in half the time that we thought we were going to have our animals in there. Well, we went back and did some measurements on those pastures, and this is what we found. They weren't 1,000 pounds in the first inch and 500 pounds after that. No, they were 800 pounds in the first inch and 300 pounds for the next few inches. When you add all that up for 5 inches, you only get 2,000 pounds. If you can follow my numbers here, that 2,000 pounds, very simply, if you have a 1,000-pound residual and you have 2,000 pounds to start with, you only have 1,000 pounds of available forage. If you have 3,000 pounds to start with a 1,000-pound residual, you have 2,000 pounds available forage. 2,000 pounds versus 1,000 pounds is 1/2. So they saw what they saw, and the assumption of that first side was incorrect. It wasn't like that at all. It was really closer to the second, and sometimes closer to this third one, where we only had 500 pounds in the first inch and 200 pounds above that, and that only gives you 5 inches, 1,300 pounds. 1,300 pounds of dry matter, and if you want to leave 1,000, it only gives you 300 pounds of grazing. No one leaves them in there for 300 pounds. They eat them. They basically let their animals eat to the ground because there's still forage out until it's gone. Well, the bottom line is this. The density of forage is it comes back to forage. What we want to have is every square inch of that field covered in solar panels. Everything. The more dense, the better it is. And it could be multiple species, could be single species, depends on the goals of the pasture or of the owner. But the end result is we want to fill that field with green stuff growing fast, capturing sunlight, turning that sunlight into carbohydrates and proteins, and therefore our animals are able to consume it. That's our good forage management. So those are rules of thumb. Now in Douglas County, Oregon, where I am, in Roseburg in Southwest Oregon, there were a lot of pastures on the right-hand side. There were a few pastures up to 2,000, the center one, and very few, maybe no pastures were at the left. That's not true anymore. We have many, many fields that are at that left-hand one. So what happens on a regular pasture? Where do you put your fences, and how do you manage this thing? Okay, so let's take a field. This is a rectangular field in May and early June. And I say rectangular, and I make this, it's kind of a joke here in Oregon. I'll say, oh, well, all fields are rectangular, and everyone kind of snickers and laughs, because very few are once you get outside the valley. But in some places, or a lot of places around the country, I'd say Minnesota and Iowa, and there are people who are listening. It's not a joke. In any case, so take a look at this field. It's a field that's got a creek running from the upper left to the lower right-hand side, and that kind of darkened area on the right-hand side is it's a more denser, poorly drained soil. So this is our field. I don't care, whatever the acreage is. Don't worry about the acreage. It's a pattern. You'll see what happens. So first thing we do is put a couple of transmission lines across it. These are electric fences. They don't have to be permanent. In fact, they could be, but they don't have to be. They could be step-in posts for the turbo wire. They could be electronet. On my place, I've got 2-inch ribbon, electrified ribbon, on step-in posts that have been there for years and years and years. In any case, so I've got these transmission lines. I can hook cross fencing to it, electric cross fencing, electronet or anything else. I could hook it to it anywhere along that. So I started on the upper left-hand side. I put my animals in. And I say, well, okay, I got 2 days of feed. Look on the upper right, it said each grazing cell is 2 days. So there's my 2 days of feed. And then the next one is another 2 days of feed. And the next one's another 2 days of feed. And notice that what happens is they're not equal. That's because the forage is not equal. There's less forage as we're going to the right, so therefore I need more space for 2 days worth of feed. And then when we go through these 4 cells, then I drop down into the middle there, and I got 2 days of feed. There's a lot of forage on that left side right now. This is in the spring, and then and this is the pattern. We just keep on putting fences. We leapfrog, and as you can see, there's more space on the right. Why is that? Well, because it's not a well-drained soil. It's colder. It's not good forage growth here in the May and early June, the way the better drained soils are. So when we get down to the bottom, the same pattern, and we cross over and we get through, a month, maybe there's about a month or a little, maybe, I don't know, there's about a month's worth of feed in that field for those animals. Now let's switch. Instead of going from May to early June, look at the top of your screen, and there's from late July to August. So now we're looking at late summer, mid to late summer. And if you're in the northern part, you got that summer slump. If you got Kentucky bluegrass or perennial ryegrass, and it slows down considerably. But the other part of the field does not. So let's just see. And we start off, and right away you notice there's not as much forage on that upper left-hand side. So we have to set our fence further for 2 days worth of feed. And we only got 3 on the top instead of 4. But then we're in the second line. And again, we set 2 days worth of feed. You can see the rest of the fencing. But as you get to the right, they get closer together because there's a lot more feed in there because the ground is less well-drained. It is not as well-drained, but it maintains its moisture very nicely through the summer, and you get a lot more growth in this particular field. And so we get down to the bottom, and the same concept. So that's how we've set our fence. And that's how we've moved our fences through this pattern. Now I just took 2 days. That's just arbitrary. Could be 3 days, could be 4 days, could be 5 days. That's up to you. But this gives you the concept, the principles of moving fence. Now let's do this. Let's look at both cycles, one on top of the other, and see where the fencing lies. The red fencing is the August fencing. That was what we just did, and I'm just reproducing it right here. All right. And now let's lay the May fencing on top of that. That's the blue lines. They're not the same. They're not the same because the forage didn't grow the same. In May, the forage in that field was growing a certain way. By the time we got to August, it was growing a different way. There could have been different species had dominated and emerged. It could have been a matter of moisture. It could be fertility points. It could be any number of things. But the point is, the forage does not grow smoothly, homogeneously throughout the year. And everyone who raises pastures knows this. And this fencing simply follows where the forage is. There's a couple of things about that. Number one, the fencing is going to change throughout the year. That says don't put in permanent fence on your cross fencing because things are going to change. Now, those people who are very experienced know that's not always the case, because once you start really doing it year after year, you know where things are. But the point is you're still learning. If you're learning, and if you've got fields you've never worked before, or you're moving fence, you move fence, you're able to do that because you're able to adjust. That's the second thing. You're adjusting to the conditions of that month. And if you change your forages, you change your fertility, you change the weather, all of which happen, you can make all those adjustments on the fly, which is exactly what management-intensive grazing is doing, because you are intensively managing. What you're doing is you're allocating feed. What you're doing is you're setting a couple of days' worth of feed ahead of the animals, putting the animals in there, using the animals, your sheep, to harvest that feed and moving on to the next cell and harvest the feed again in the next cell. This makes it very, very responsive. It really keeps the animals in phase 2, which is the highly nutritious, most efficient part of the growth. It also makes scientists pull their hair out, because every year is going to be different and it's hard to get replications. And therefore it's really hard to publish information about it, because it's like every basketball game is not exactly the same. You have to play each game differently. And that's what we're in the middle of. We're trying to play this basketball game with fences and animals. So lots of decisions have to be made. This, by the way, is down in the Fjordland in New Zealand. So here's some specifics of some intensive grazing. We're getting in the next few minutes. We'll finish up, and then we'll open up for questions, and I'll put my camera back on. So here's some specifics. Introduce the sheep at the top of phase 2. Remove the sheep at the bottom of the phase 2. The residual, don't graze into phase 1. This adds 7 to 14 days to reach the bottom of phase 2. And if you're grazing into the residual, you're going to stress some plants. Some plants don't do well if you get constantly hammered. In addition, if you stress some plants, and those plants probably be your best ones because they'll be your most palatable and most nutritious as they're coming up, it opens up, and if they die off, it's going to open up ground. If you open up ground, here comes the weeds. It turns out that most weeds, do not do well in an intensive grazing situation. They don't compete when they're under good forage management. That's not true. Canada thistle is going to come through no matter what. But most weeds often don't do well in a very, very dense, highly well-managed pasture. Another thing, avoid phase 3. Phase 3 is more mature growth, and you all remember what a hay crop looks like, a mature hay crop. That's phase 3. Grazing into phase 2, if you keep grazing into phase 2, it's very efficient. As you remember the way the curve, the sigmoid curve goes, the S curve, that's the efficient, nearly vertical part of the curve. The nutrition is excellent, and the forages are healthy, they're sustainable, and they're growing fast. So here are the 4 rules, 4 main rules of management-intensive grazing. Number 1, stay in phase 2 growth. Absolutely critical to try to do that. And there are all sorts of techniques like a grazer's wedge and things like that, but that's beyond the scope of this session. Number 2, leave enough residual. In fact, become fanatical about residual. It's like being fanatical about second cuts. You should leave it. Pastures that have residual of 200 or 300 pounds. Now, some species, that's what you want, like alfalfa. But then you give alfalfa an extremely long rest period. That's different than a lot of other fields, other species. Alfalfa is a specific species that stores its carbohydrates below in the roots, and therefore and you treat it like a hay crop, even if you have animals. That doesn't change the fact of knowing what you're doing in terms of residual. We want 800 to 1,000 pounds residual. The third thing, protect the regrowth. Now, this is a kind of a very important thing. A very important thing. Very simply, a 5-day rule means this. I don't want animals in a grazing cell for more than 5 days, period. Why? Because in 5 or 6 days, what's happening is you start seeing green growth if you got fertile fields and rain. And if you start seeing green growth and you still have animals in that area, what are they going to eat? They got nothing else to do all day. They're going to walk around and they're looking and oh, that's tasty, that's tasty, that's tasty. And what they're doing is they're eating their regrowth. If they're eating their regrowth, those are exactly the type of plants you want to maintain in the pasture, and they are preferentially going after them. So if you put animals in a field for more than 5 or 6 days, what you've got basically is a set stocking situation in which you're hammering your best plants. Now, there's lots of grazing type of patterns, forward grazing, creek grazing, multi-species grazing, all that. They've got all funny, wonderful names. I don't care. I don't want animals in a particular cell, grazing cell, for more than 5 days. After that, then they're starting to eat the regrowth, and I need to protect that regrowth in a fanatical way. Finally, and this has a lot of ramifications on management, the water and minerals have to move with the sheep. Wherever the sheep are, that's where the water is, that's where the minerals are. That means they don't go back to the barn at night because they're walking back and forth. Now, yeah, you have to work in predators and all that type of stuff, fair enough. But be aware, if they have water and minerals where they're grazing, that's where they're going to graze. If, on the other hand, the water is on one side of the pasture under a tree, that's where they're going to end up hanging out. Same with the trace mineral mixture. And there are all sorts of mineral feeders that you can drag behind a four-wheeler very easily. And one of the biggest flocks in this area has thousands of ewes. They move their minerals every day. They just haul it behind, just drag it on skids behind a four-wheeler. So we're getting to the end here. This bison, I had to pay it time and a half to stand there long enough to get that picture. But you do have to make some choices. And frankly, I wouldn't necessarily want to be a person in one of those porta potties right now. So here we are. What we're trying to do here, very simply, is capture sunlight. Forages capture sunlight. And what we do when we start intensive grazing, we do management intensive grazing, is we're more than sheep producers. We're also grass farmers. And we are trying to get that grass, meaning forage in general. We are trying to capture sunlight and turn that sunlight into meat, lamb, wool, milk, cheese. So being a shepherd, or you have cattle, goats, or dairy farmer, you're capturing grass, you're capturing sunlight and turning it you're converting that sunlight into products that humans can eat. I don't think there's anything more honorable and better rewarding than that, but we have to be able to do it well and sustainably. So I'm going to stop right here and ask for some questions. Jay?
Yeah. Thank you, Woody. Once again, I want to let people know that you can raise your hand. If you have a microphone attached to your computer, I'll unmute you here in the system, and you'll be able to talk directly to Woody if you'd like to ask him a question that way. You're also welcome to type your question into the question box, which should be on your control panel over there on the right. And a couple people have done that, so let me address those first. We had a question about reseeding. When do you know when it's best to reseed a pasture? And the background on this is they said we recently put in a drainage ditch in a field that was very wet, but the grass is not very good quality. Will management intensive grazing help, or should we just reseed?
Well, the answer to that is a multiple answer. Reseeding is renovation, and renovation is the type of thing you don't take on lightly because you're going to spend a lot of money doing that. Depends what was growing in there before. Depends what the fertility of the land is. First thing I would do is take soil tests to know whether or not it's not growing because it doesn't have enough nutrients. If it doesn't have enough nutrients, you can reseed all you want. Nothing's going to happen. The thing would be to take soil tests, figure out what it is that you want to do on that field, what is already growing in there. It could be what's growing in there will respond to good intensive grazing, good management. Or it could be all you've got is bent grass and some low-growing annuals. That's not going to respond at all. So it very much depends what it is that's actually already there, what the fertility of the ground is before you make that decision to renovate or to reseed. What you can always do is I'm not sure where in the country you are, and Jay, because this is a real, if you're listening, Jay, you can hear this. Because we're dealing with agronomic type of stuff, being in Maine and being in Florida is really, really different. So
right.
If someone wants to say what state they're in, I mean geographical state, it would be a little bit helpful. But the end result is what you can often do is get bags of annual ryegrass seed and just broadcast them broadcast the seed 40, 50 pounds on the per acre on the ground and see what comes up. And try that for a while and learn some of your skills of management intensive grazing. And then you're not stuck with a perennial, but you also got some feed, and that might be helpful in times when you don't know what you're doing.
Okay, and the other question that was typed in, I believe you answered with one of your later slides, but I'm going to add to it a little bit. The question was, what would be the maximum number of days you should leave a flock in each cell as long as they are large enough? And I believe you addressed that with your 5-day rule. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I would add to that, though, and this is out of curiosity on my part, and that is that, does that not matter on the climate or how quickly grass grows in different parts of the country? In other words, is how hard and fast is that 5-day rule based off of the climate that you're in?
That's that's an excellent question. In places like that are dry, let's say eastern Colorado,
Yeah.
or Saskatchewan, or Alberta, and I've given equivalent talks in all these places, things are different, and it would depend on how fast stuff is growing and how fast stuff is coming back. One thing you might do, it might be longer. Keep in mind you don't want to eat regrowth no matter where it is. You might just watch your pastures. You get out there. That 5-day rule didn't just come because we just kind of made it up. We went out and watched the pastures and wanted to see how long did it take before we started to see new green again. And it actually can be 3 or 4 days, but 5 days seems reasonable. In some places where it's drier, it might be a little bit longer. That depends. But keep in mind the concept. We're trying to protect the regrowth. And it might take a little longer to do that, it might take a little shorter, but you have to protect regrowth, because if you don't, basically you're in a set stocking position and you're just taking out your best plants.
Okay, and we do have somebody with their hand up. Tom Feldposh, your hand is up, and I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone.
Okay.
Tom, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks,
Okay.
Jay.
Go ahead and talk
hi,
to
Dr.
me.
Just
Hello.
a question. Hi, we're in Michigan and just have a small flock right now. And the question was, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on avoiding phase 3. So we have our sheep in our different cells, if you will, and often the forage gets ahead of the sheep, so in the next cell. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I think I probably missed the point a little bit, but I just want to understand better if a cell is already into phase 3, you're saying don't put the sheep in there, you want to pay it off or do something else with it?
Not necessarily. Firstly, if you already have cells and you're working like that, you use a grazer's wedge. Are you still there, Tom?
Yeah, I'm still here. No, I don't use it. Okay.
A lot of people, probably very few people have heard about it, but it's a way of taking a look at your whole place. And I don't have a slide on that. That was a more advanced topic than I wanted to get into it here, but it's basically a way of keeping track of all your fields and seeing where they are at any given time. Okay. And then setting up put it in a spreadsheet, and then letting the spreadsheet show a bar graph high to low, and you could see which fields are supposed to be next, and you could plan your jumps 5, 6, 7 moves out. Okay. When you get into phase 3, you do have a bit of a problem because other things are coming into phase 3 soon, which means that if you put animals into phase 3 and try to eat it down, by the time you get that one down, you got 4 other cells that are already moving into phase 3.
Right. So
the best way to deal with that is top it or hay it.
Yep.
Or get some other animals that you can, let's say cattle. That would be a good. If this guy is a consistent problem, get some horses. Do something that can break the parasite cycle and use that as an advantage. If you're fortunate enough to be growing enough forage to have more than you need, or at that moment, and that's why you're in phase 3, you really should top it off. Because if you don't, what you do is you try to put your animals in there.
Yep.
While they're consuming it, a lot of other cells are all going into phase 3, and basically you're losing control of the forage growth.
Right. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Dee, and Dee is in Iowa, and they've had a very hard winter there. Their pastures are coming on late because of that, so things are really uneven or spotty. Some areas of the pasture have 5 inches of growth, and some only have 1 inch. Typically, they turn in when they have about 5 inches. What should they do this year? Should they wait for the short areas to grow up, or let them in now because the taller areas are 5 inches, and then should they go ahead and reseed any sparse areas? If you want to address that also.
Well, I'm not, not knowing the place. I don't know how, are you talking about areas that are 10 feet across or areas that are an acre across? So if they're areas that are large enough and you have enough sheep, get more fencing. If you have areas that are let's say you have an area that's half an acre, and you got 15 sheep, or do you have an area that's 3 acres and you got 300 sheep? I don't know. But if you got areas that are fenceable, use a lot of electronet or the equivalent. I know Stan would be very happy I said that. Fence it off, put the animals in there. Now, 5 inches doesn't necessarily mean that you got a lot of forage out there. Do a dry matter on it and find out how much you got. Dry it down in a microwave, make cuttings and just dry it down in a microwave, and figure out how much forage you got there. 5 inches may be only 1,200 pounds. That's not a lot of forage. So you might be being given a gift to step back and wait and see what you got, and let the rest of the pastures come on. Again, not knowing if those 5 inches are dense or not. I don't know how much is out there. But you can use some electric, if it's large enough, use some electric fence, and you have an opportunity to have irregular shaped pastures, because that's just the nature of where the forages are grown.
Okay, thank you. And Maureen Sullivan, you got your hand up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Maureen, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank
Okay.
you. I came in late, Dr. Lane. I'm sorry about that. I have pasture in upstate New York, and I would love to add sheep. That's my plan. It's old dairy pasture, about 25 acres. It was very hilly and brushy, and we've been brush hogging and mowing. As we mow each year, we notice that clover's coming in. Is that bad for sheep?
No. Clovers are fine.
Okay.
Clover. Well, you might want to get someone to identify what type of clover you have.
It's a white clover.
White clover, which is fairly typical. Yeah, clovers are fine. Clovers are excellent pasture.
Okay.
Clovers, you want to mix clover and grass, but clovers people would kill for clover.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Maureen.
I once heard that it meant that the soil was poor because clover is like acid, and that it meant, your soil was poor.
Well, take a lot of those, what you used to hear, and throw them out.
Okay.
I mean, just firstly get a soil test.
Okay.
And learn how to do that, and get a good lab, and they don't cost very much. And considering how much more you're going to spend to manage that pasture and renovate that pasture or fertilize that pasture, get a soil test first for 15 or 20 bucks. And so you know what's going on there, at least where your starting point is.
Okay.
And then also pull up the clover carefully. Pull it up, and this is true. Anyone in the country can do this. If you have legumes at all, clovers, alfalfa, whatever, pull them up carefully. Take a big clod of dirt with it, and knock off the dirt carefully. And the best way of doing that is put the whole clump on a screen and spray it down with water. And look carefully at the roots of that clover. And what you should see on those roots are those little nodules, those little rhizobia nodules. That's where the bacteria live that fix nitrogen. Clover can grow just fine without those nodules. But then it's not fixing nitrogen, it's just a plant. What you want is clover that's actually healthily fixing nitrogen, otherwise it's just another plant. And those of you who are more experienced in pasture management, you want clovers in there, you want legumes in there, in part to fix nitrogen, bring nitrogen into the system. And you want to make sure that the manufacturing process is actually working. Because sometimes it does, especially in low pHs.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you,
Good
Maureen.
luck with that, Maureen.
Okay, we got a question from Jerry in New York, and he asked if you can comment on clipping paddocks after grazing. Is it necessary? How high to clip? How many days after removing the sheep?
Why would you want to?
I assume he's talking about measuring regrowth or something along those lines, or what's left out there.
I don't understand why you'd want to clip after, unless you're moving the sheep out. It's too early. If you have, are you maybe you're thinking that, oh, I left the sheep in there and it really looks really rough, and so I got high points and low points and whatever. If that's the case, if you got patches or large patches that are 2 feet high and other patches are eaten to the ground, basically you haven't you've had too much space for your sheep. You're allowing them the luxury of eating what they want as opposed to what you want them to eat. And there's a concept in the world called stocking density, which I didn't go into. But stocking density, which is extremely important in this type of management, or at least to know about it, it's not stocking rate. Stocking rate is the number of animal units per acre per year, or per however you want to call it. And that's important in range country. It makes less sense in improved pastures, almost no sense in fact. But stocking density is the number of pounds of animals per acre, period. It's a snapshot, how your grazing intensity or your grazing pressure. So if you have 10 100-pound animals in an acre, you have 1,000 pounds of animal in an acre, you have your stocking density is 1,000 pounds. You can do that calculation even with an estimation. If you've got only 1,000 or 2,000 pounds per acre, you're giving those animals a huge amount of choices. Intensive grazing is running 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 pounds an acre. Remember, if you stay in phase 2, it's just when you get to the bottom of phase 2, and then you move. So you're always going to leave a residual. So if you know your stocking density and you can increase the stocking density, what that does is it forces animals to eat more evenly. It forces the manure to be spread more evenly. And you won't have the big high clumps. So I really am not sure why one would want to be clipping after the animals have left, except as a sign that maybe the stocking density was much too low. So, and this is very common. When you first do an intensive grazing, we always be conservative. You're afraid to move the fence up too close. As you get more and more used to it, you get more confident, and you start bringing your stocking density up by moving the fence in. So it's smaller and smaller areas. You go, ooh, this works better and better, but you also have the better skills. So trying to clip afterwards, I'm not sure why one would want to do that.
Okay, very good. Diana Mondino, you got your hand up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Diana, are you there?
Yes, actually I have 4 different questions. I'm not based in the U.S., I'm based in Argentina. And so you get international, Dr. Lane. What is the biggest flock size that we could handle?
Well, isn't Argentina upside down?
Yeah, exactly. In every single sense of the word.
Well, okay, we won't go there completely.
Okay.
All right. The flock size depends entirely on your skills and your skills as a shepherd and your skills as a forage manager. I mean, I personally got only a few acres in my place, right? But I work with people who run 2,500, 3,000 sheep on intensive grazing, who are moving every day, and have some of the best forages I've ever seen in the world. So that's based on your skill as a forage manager, and of course as a shepherd, and all the other things that go into being a shepherd with large numbers and being able to be very efficient. So there's no limit to that. And if you get larger and larger flock sizes, you get other people to help out who become good forage managers.
Okay. What about the capacity of sheep to endure heat? We have very ample temperatures, and in the summer, it can easily get into the hundreds. Is that a problem?
Remember, sheep are desert animals.
Oh, sorry?
Sheep are desert animals. They evolved in the desert. They have wool on them for a reason. If they have a fleece, or that top of that fleece will be 120 degrees, 115 degrees, but the skin will be 90, 95. It's not, that usually is not a problem, as long as they have water and all the other things that go into good husbandry. But being hot, Australia is hot.
Okay. So, and about water, how far can they walk to get water? I know the ideal is to have it very, very close, but can they walk, let's say, 500 yards?
500 yards is a long way.
Okay.
In cattle, we figure, rule of thumb in cattle is, and cattle aren't sheep because this is a behavior issue. In cattle, they'll go about 600 feet by themselves, meaning
Okay.
if you have if you have water that's no more than 600 feet from where the end of the other side of the paddock, right, which kind of defines the width of a paddock, that means an animal, a cow or steer or heifer, will get up and walk by itself to the water trough and come back. If it's beyond 600 feet, they won't do it by themselves. They'll get up as a group. And that's
Sorry, I
probably
meant
evolutionary
600.
reasons because of lions and wolves and stuff like that. So, and that means that if it's very far, you need large containers because you're going to have a large amount of animals coming at one time. If you've got something close up, then you only need a small container for water because you only got 1 or 2 animals walking up at one time. It doesn't become a group effort. So some of the places I work with that have thousands of ewes and sheep that are moving them every day, they use hoses a lot, and they put the water very close to the animals in the cells. They don't have animals walk long distances, and that completely depends on your setup and on your operation. And as a private consultant, I work with all sorts of clients, and each one's different, so I can't give a rule of thumb there. I can just tell you what the cattlemen do, and also sheep, being very different in behavior, often won't go anywhere without being in a group.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Diana. We had a question on fencing, and I don't know how deep you want to go into that, but the question itself is, in irrigated pasture, using hand lines, what kind of temporary fence would you recommend?
Well, you always need some good perimeter fencing, period, unless you like legal issues with your neighbors. But cross fencing, we have electric fencing. We have all sorts of wonderful, wonderful stuff for electric fencing. And use it. Learn to use it. Sometimes you can have real posts and real high tensile electric fence. And sometimes just, electronets you can do a lot, or turbo wire. You can do all sorts of things. And there's a couple of people I know who work intensive grazing who say, use temporary electric fence for a couple of years. And if you find you're putting the fences in the same spot every year for a couple of years, that's when you finally put some permanent fencing.
Okay. Very good. We have somebody in the Thumb area of Michigan that says, when grazing ewes with lambs, how to figure the amount of dry matter needed as lambs grow and start eating forage.
Well, when they're young, they're not eating much forage. That's why you put 5% in there. Because the ewes are actually eating less than 5% usually, but nonetheless, you got lambs. Then you wean them, assuming you wean them. If you wean them, then you start to treat them as a flock of lambs. If you are having the ewes and the lambs, then you start to put together, well, what I would do is once the lambs got to be 50, 60 pounds, I'd add them in with the weight of the ewes, figure out the total weight of the lambs and the ewes, and take 5% of that.
Okay. We have somebody in northeastern New York that has an old fallow field that's now overgrown with wild grasses, and they're wondering if you have any advice on that, on ascertaining the current carrying capacity, or is it best just to improve this before they introduce stock?
I haven't a clue. Napalm works.
Yeah.
Not knowing the place, I really don't know. I can't give an answer to that. There's the local extension service. It depends on what the land is like. By all means, take soil tests so you have some idea what you got. Okay. Without soil tests, it's like having a doctor go in and start administering drugs to a patient and not knowing any of their body specs. So take a soil test.
Okay, and here's somebody who does have a soil test. They say, we are converting a logged parcel to pasture. We have a soil test that shows need 10-40-0 recommendation. pH is good. On this parcel, there is a wide variation of microclimes from very wet to hilltop. How would you approach this challenge?
Where are you talking about?
She didn't give a location here. Let me see if I can find it. Great Lakes area.
Okay. Well, not knowing the field, and I can't see the field. Here's the thing: if you got a whole bunch of different, let's say you got a field with it's got hills and it's got some wet areas, and it's a field that's 80 acres. You may really have 4 or 5 different fields in there. and each of those biological areas should be treated differently. That's how we test the soils, and that's how you would manage them in terms of the fertility is probably different on the hillside versus in the flats. You certainly don't want to apply 10-40-0 on everything, because I wouldn't. There in some places it might be much too much, and the other places it might not. You might be short of phosphorus, potassium, and there's no potassium in that. And you wouldn't know it unless you take soil tests from all those different places. You might, when you have a field that was fenced whenever it was fenced, that fencing was in place for whatever reason, and you may have inherited it, or that might have been the convenience, and there it is. You actually might have multiple fields within that, and you should manage those multiple fields, each one separately, and think out where the fencing should go for that. So in one part of the field, you might want to use something like a fescue or festivalium type of field of grass base because it's kind of wet. Another place might be orchard grass, or where you have much dry, where it's got good drainage. In some places, you might want to put straight alfalfa if you've got a pH of 6.5. So, and if it's fenced the old way, that all might be in one field. That might be in one large area that's called a field, but in reality, from a management point of view, you might have multiple different fields in there. The only way to manage it accurately and well is to break it up into those multiple fields.
Okay. We have several questions on the grass getting ahead of the sheep, so to speak, and I got about 3 of them here I can kind of give to you, and you can address them perhaps all at once. One of them says, I have read that it's...
Now, hang on. This is not in Colorado or Washington.
No, these are up in New York for the most part, although one of them is from Colorado. But anyway, it says, I've read that it's okay to put sheep on in early April in New York, even though the grass isn't very tall, just so the grass doesn't get ahead of you. It would seem it is in phase 1, but otherwise the grass will be too tall later on. Are you saying we should definitely wait until the end of phase 3? That's one question. And then the other 2 following that have to do with topping.
All right, let's get the first one. Let's
go
the first one. Here you got spring. You finally got grass. It's in phase 1, but by gosh, it's green, and it's highly nutritious. And so you really want to put it out there so that you can slow down the tidal wave that you know is going to come. Well, no, don't do that. Wait until that grass gets into phase 2. Then the first fields or 2 that you get out there, then that's when we start to use this in a more sophisticated way. Those are the fields that you can graze into phase 1 on purpose, because you want to slow down that regrowth. Where the other fields are cranking along in their spring growth, you slow down some fields. But don't put animals out there before it's well into phase 2, because you're going to have weaker plants and you're going to wipe out those early plants. If you put animals out there when it's still in phase 1, those plants haven't had a chance to set down good roots yet. They haven't been able to store enough carbohydrates. When they get wiped out, they're going to be coming back from their roots again. They're going to be weakened, probably more apt to be hit by nematodes and other things, and therefore replaced by other plants that you don't want. So always don't put animals in until it's in phase 2, but you can strategically use that phase 1, phase 2 growth to slow down some fields in their regrowth, because you want to control it, at least partially control the tidal wave of spring growth. Now, the other questions, Jay, had to do with topping.
Yeah, and just some general questions on topping. Is that mowing?
Yeah.
What kind of equipment? Any advice you have on that, I guess, when you do
I don't
it,
know.
how you do it?
I mean, it depends on what you got in your field and why you want to top, and do you really have things in phase 3 growth?
Yeah.
Or is it just tall enough? Some species like orchard grass or timothy are going to be pretty high compared to bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, and so you might check where you are in terms of the actual total, the mass that's out there. You can top with any cutter bar as high as you possibly can go. I mean, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Try to avoid it.
Okay. And one in particular said that they're grazing an orchard, and they were asking about equipment, I assume, because you can't, probably a little bit of trouble going through trees and whatnot.
Well, I would use sheep rather than,
Yeah, they're having trouble keeping up with the pasture. It looks like that it gets ahead of the sheep, and they're having to clip, but having difficulty doing it.
Well, then use fencing. Some
Yeah.
fields you either need more sheep or you need to move them through, and use some turbo wire, some sort of fencing, to keep them in areas where you can take it down in close to phase one and then move on to the next one. One thing about orchards, be real careful about. Orchards, depending on the type of orchard and what the orchardist used on those trees, if they use Bordeaux mixture, which is calcium, which is copper sulfate and I think slate lime, or limestone, whatever. Nonetheless, it's a copper product, and the forage, and sometimes the forage that grows in the underneath in the orchards can be high, very high in copper, 70, 100 parts per million. I've seen those numbers. You might want to grab some forage, some grab samples of that forage and send it to a lab and see what the mineral profiles of those are, because you might want to look at that. And make sure you get them molybdenum and sulfur levels if you're going to check for copper.
Okay, very good. And we have a couple of technical questions along those lines. Somebody asked about how about adding minerals to the soil, and specifically they want to know, have you heard of accelerite?
I have not heard of accelerite. You could try adding uranium to the soil, and then you can graze at night.
Okay. Okay.
No, I'll give you a more serious answer. That's only
That'll make your sheep glow too, right?
Yeah, you get really glowing reports from your meat cutter. People all over the country are going, oh no. In places like New Zealand, for example, where they don't feed trace mineral mixtures, their way of doing things, or has been in the past, has been to add things like cobalt or manganese or selenium to the fertilizer. The only state that I know of that can add selenium to fertilizer is Oregon, and we do that here. No other state, I don't think any other state permits it. But putting stuff onto the soil as a general rule, sometimes will be picked up by plants, and sometimes they won't be. And just because you put calcium on, for example, onto the soil as limestone, doesn't mean that calcium levels in the forage are going to be higher. It's better, you have more control if you have a balanced trace mineral mixture that you can actually provide the sheep, and to do it in a way that the sheep actually consume it, and that's a skill in itself. Okay. You can control that, and particularly if you're in different areas that might have magnesium tetany problems or something like that. You can alter the recipe for certain months. That you can do that with a mineral mix that you are able to control. Okay. So there are other ways of adding things, but trying to put it into the soil and thinking that it is going to be a one-to-one relationship between what you put in the soil and what ends up in the plant ends up in the animal's mouth. Too many assumptions, too many steps there. I don't think that's usually a good idea. Okay,
very good. Since you brought up sheep at night, I'll go ahead and slip this question in from Brett that says, should you leave the sheep out on the pasture, or you leave the sheep out on the pasture all day or put them away at night? I'm not sure if the wording's right there, but basically the question is do you bring them in at night? Does that help the intensive grazing area? Do you have any rules of thumb there in terms of, I assume he's worried about them bedding down and...
Well, the big worry there is predators.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be the only reason I would see bringing them anywhere at night.
Okay.
No, they don't. Remember, sheep evolved millions of years before we got around, and they did okay at night. That does bring up a topic, though. They'll bed down somewhere, higher ground usually. Depends what the pastures are like. But if you've got trees on those pastures or shady areas, they will tend to bed down where there's trees, or an area that's high with trees. That's what they really love. But whatever. Think about what that means for fertility. Because when they bed down and they stand up, what happens when sheep stand up, or cattle? So areas around trees end up collecting the fertility from the rest of the pasture. So be aware that that's an ongoing controversy. But it does happen. And, areas under trees tend to accumulate the soil fertility If you put fertilizer out in the middle of the field, the stuff tends to move under the trees over time. But to come back to your original question, should you bring sheep in at night? There's no reason, except predators, and that can be a serious, that's people. Everyone knows that, and there may be situations in which that's the only way you're going to be able to handle.
Okay, very good. And then somebody asked a question.
Oh, let me finish one other thing. I forgot one thing. Yeah. Legumes. If you have high clover pastures, high alfalfa pastures, and high meaning high percentages. One of the concerns we have on that, raising sheep on that, especially if they're pure stands, and we do this all the time. We have animals on pure clover stands, pure alfalfa stands all the time, including goats, is bloat. And bloat can be a very serious problem. Well, bloat usually occurs in the first few hours you put animals out on pasture. If they're hungry and conditions are right and whatever else. So you put them out there within 6 or 10 hours and you've got animals down with bloat. The issue there is if you bring animals back and forth every day onto pastures, put them in the barn, back out of the pasture, into the barn, out of the pasture every day, what you're doing essentially is resetting the clock in terms of initiating the pasture every day. And if those pastures are real high in clovers or alfalfa, you're kind of resetting the stage or high risk period for bloat. So there's always chances of bloat when there's a frost and something. I'm not talking about that. This could be in the middle of summer I'm talking about. So take that into account about bringing the animals back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
Okay.
It's best to keep the animals on a field on a continuous basis.
Very good. We have a question from northeastern South Dakota, and they say they will be seeding cool season and warm season pastures this spring, and they want to know, is it appropriate to graze it in the first year?
What species of warm seasons?
That's not given to us. No.
Those are C4 grasses. I don't know what species. I presume they're perennials, things like switchgrass and things like that. Mm-hmm. Cool seasons, yeah, absolutely, if you know what you're doing. I'm not as familiar with warm season grasses, but if you're in northeast South Dakota, they have an extension service there, and they would know how to treat those species under northeast South Dakota conditions, and also the fertility of that soil. Right? We always can graze the first year on stuff, but we have to be careful. But it all depends, and that's where you talk to local people and people depending on the species, actual species you're dealing with. Okay. And it's extremely important to know that.
We've got time for just a couple more here that have come in. One of them was specifics on how do you know when your grass has reached the top of phase 2? Is it basically when the grass starts to head out?
No. Next question.
I want to answer the first half.
No, it's heading out. So it's well into phase 3 at that point, completely. And especially if I could take Italian ryegrass and grow it in the summer the first year, it'll be in phase 3. It can be in phase 3 and it won't head out at all. Or you do the same thing with winter wheat and just plant it in the spring and you can get phase 3 growth and it's not going to head out. So no, just figure out what the amounts are, what's out there. See, we're not talking about heading out. We're talking about slowing down the growth in phase 3. And that happens long before it heads out. So learn visually after taking a lot of samples and drying them down and getting an idea, what is phase 2 or phase 3 growth given the species mix that are in your that's in your pasture. And it's going to look different. Depends on what the species mix is. Someone who has a chicory, orchard grass, a Timothy mixture, it's going to look really different than a ball clover Bermuda grass pasture. So it depends. You get used to your own pastures and you'll be able to see. But it's the amount that's out there that's the important thing. Not when it's headed out, it's well into phase 3 growth, but it gets into phase 3 growth before that.
Very good. And the last question, what is your opinion of adding commercial chicken farm manure to your pasture? If you need it, if you need the nitrogen, is there a downside?
Well, no. There's not a downside for the nitrogen part. In fact, if you're organic, you have no choices. You have very little choices about what nitrogen sources you can use. Poultry farm stuff is perfectly good to put on pastures with one exception. if the young broilers, and this is not true for egg layers, but broilers sometimes a farmer who raises a couple 100,000 of these animals, broilers will use high copper in their diets as a growth promoter. Hogs and poultry can do that, but only when they're growing. It doesn't do any good for breeding stock, and certainly egg layers it has nothing to do. But if the manure is coming from a broiler operation, you might want to check with the manager or the feed person or whatever to see what the levels of copper are in the feed. In the sheep feed, we get concerned when you see levels above 10, 12, 15%, to 15 parts per million. Depends on the molybdenum levels. To give you a perspective, a broiler operation can have 250 parts per million or higher levels of copper in that feed. And that'll come out in the manure, and you put the manure on the ground, and you put lots of tons of that stuff over time. There could be a problem in the forage when it grows there. Two things. Number one, find out where that stuff is coming from. If it is a broiler operation, and is the broiler operation using high copper? And two, just test the forage. Just take the forage, do a grab sample of the forage, test it, send it in, and see what the copper levels are. That'll tell you as well. That would be my major concern.
Okay.
For the rest of it, it's a good source of nitrogen.
Yeah, very well. Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Lane for his presentation this evening and patiently answering quite a few questions. And I'd like to thank all our listeners and viewers out there for sending in those questions. Hopefully you learned a lot of information tonight that you can put into practice and help your operation. Once again, thanks to the American Sheep Industry Association and the Rebuild the Sheep Inventory Committee for sponsoring today's program and also our future programs. And I can go ahead and let folks know that we will have another webinar on August 26th with Dan Moracle of Iowa State University, and one on September 23rd with Richard Earhart from Michigan State University. So we're working on finalizing the details behind those webinars, and I encourage you all to join us for that. With that, I think I'll go ahead and thank you, Woody, once again, and
thank you,
great
Jay.
presentation on managing your pastures better, and bid everybody farewell, and until next time. Thank you.